Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
The West is a fascinating new book, History of an Idea, a comprehensive intellectual history of the ideas of the West. It is by Georgios Varouxakis, and I'm delighted to say that he joins me live on the line now. Georgios, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. The West as a concept. Is this you argue in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the West is almost a concept of empire, and perhaps we need to be looking at the West in a different way. What's the basic premise, please?
Yeah, well, to start with, one of the arguments, and perhaps the most surprising, is that the West was not conceived in order to promote imperialism. The consensus there are two things. One is the popular understanding of the West. If you ask people, as I've been doing for 13 years while researching the book, you get a number of answers, but there is a cluster of two contradictory answers. One is, it has always been there. It's since the Greeks fought off the Persians, the West has been this and that and the other. So some people see it as an almost perennial Plato to NATO thing. And some other people tell you, it obviously started with the Cold War after the First World War. So they see it as an Atlanticist West led by America and so on. In between, there is something else, which is the academic consensus, the consensus among specialists, historians, geographers who have studied the idea of the West as a self-perception historically, and they all agree, more or less, that it was conceived in order to justify imperialism, and it was invented around in the 1880s, 1890s, in the very end of the 19th century, to justify British imperialism. Now, my argument is none of the above. The West started being used as of the 1820s, and became more and more used in the 1830s, and by the 1840s it was fully conceptualized, articulated by the French philosopher Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology and many other things, positivism and so on. And the reason was an attempt by West Europeans to create a new self-identification, a new identity that identified themselves vis-à-vis Russia. The term they had been using up to then, Europeans were calling themselves Europe up to then in the 18th century, and before that, Christendom. Why do they need a new term? Because Russia is part of Europe, at least since the time of Peter the Great, beginning of the 18th century. Russia is geographically part of Europe, but also part of the political system of Europe since Peter's successes in the early 18th century. So in the early 19th century, people who start worrying, Russia is not only part of Europe, it's dominating Europe. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and then with the creation of the Holy Alliance, Tsar Alexander I had come to dominate Europe. He was extremely popular among many people. He was very ambitious. He was very charming. So people started thinking in terms of how do we protect ourselves from this enormous monolithic power that is bound to devour us. And obviously they start using the historic term the West, which was the parts of Europe that used to be the part of the Western Roman Empire in the past. And so this term starts being used more and more.
But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you define the West as, as anywhere from basically from Constantinople / Istanbul heading westwards, but you miss out a couple of things. Can you argue that the West is also against the Ottomans, of course, because they are the big power brokers as well, and for centuries from Vienna through to Paris, people have been terrified about the encroaching Ottomans as well.
Absolutely, yes, very true. But what I'm trying to say in the book is the Europeans and the Christians were very happy to differentiate themselves from the Ottomans or from the Indians or from the Africans or from everybody else and still call themselves Christendom or Europe. So the Edward Said argument, the followers of Edward Said who routinely would say the West is defined itself in opposition to the East, not exactly, because the Europeans were very happy to call themselves Christendom or Europe. And differentiate themselves from the East or from the Ottomans. The reason why they need a new term is because Europe is now confusing in the early 19th century because Russia is part of it. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire is also geographically part of it, and so that's a secondary reason. But the main reason is Russia. So it is first during the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire that you have French authors, political commentators starting to talk about the West that has to defend itself against the real danger, which is Russia. If Russia takes Constantinople after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that everybody expected, Russia will dominate Europe, it will come to the Mediterranean. And so there are people who start saying the Greek Revolution is a godsend. The Greeks can become a rampart of the West. They are Europeans, they are Christians. Well, they were the wrong kind of Christians. They were Orthodox, but still they were sufficiently gearing towards the West, the educated Greeks. There had been a whole movement of Greek Enlightenment. So the Greeks were very much stressing their ancient Greek credentials and their desire to join Western Europe. So he was the educated ones, the intellectuals, of course. So people started seeing a Western federation, a West European federation that they called the West, against Russia. The Ottoman Empire was expected to collapse. Everybody thought it would collapse. The danger would be somebody else. That's what I'm trying to say. But just one tiny footnote. The person that I mentioned earlier came to define all this and to articulate it in enormous detail, Auguste Comte. Part of his plan was to abolish empires. So in a strange twist of the story, instead of the West being invented to justify imperialism, the first articulation of a West, a thorough articulation, that is Comte's, was part of a passionately anti-imperialist project.
Do we see what you might call reductive history then? If you have the idea of the West and Christendom and fighting off, we can go all the way back to Alexander and Darius and Cyrus the Great and saying, okay, we stopped them there. You then have the problem of trying to shoehorn or to fit a 19th century understanding of the world and take it all the way back to ancient times, and when you should actually be looking at the Mediterranean as a concept. So rather than having, because for centuries, Europe or the West has said, okay, basically we stop at Gibraltar, and anything going from Tunisia, Carthage, all the way around to the Levant is nothing to do with us. But in fact, that whole Mediterranean basis historically has been the center of the West or the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So what I said so far is how the term is needed, why the term is invented or reinvented in order to serve the needs of 19th century people in Western Europe who worry about Russia. But I'm not saying that the civilization that these people had developed and the civilization and culture that they adopted and co-opted as their past is not very much related to the ancient world. Yes, it is this Mediterranean civilization that concentrated many different influences from Phoenicia, from Egypt, and so on in Greece, and then through Greece went to Rome. That has been the basis of an awful lot of what these people in the 19th century consider their own. So all that inspiration is absolutely there. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying the classical texts and culture that we all consider part of the legacy of the West is not. It is, very much so. And part of my argument is that because the West has been associated with imperialism and many other unpleasant things, and because today it's used, the term Western civilization is used consistently, constantly by a certain political group in America especially, which many people don't want to have anything to do with, there is a tendency to cancel, more or less, the whole history of these texts, the canon of classical texts of ancient Greece, Rome, and so on, because they are so-called Western. This is complete nonsense, because it's throwing the baby along with the bathwater. So part of what I'm trying to do is to say, look at these things historically. Nothing is black and white. it's part of a history. Sorry, I don't want to go on and on and on, depending on what you want.
It's fine, absolutely. I'm finding this fascinating. And of course, we've had to realign because since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, those countries that we considered almost sort of almost oriental in the old style way, i.e. Eastern influence, Romania, Bulgaria, and more than ever, Ukraine, have now seemed to be brought into they're stressing their Europeanness. They're stressing their quote unquote Westernness. So it just, what is your take? Because now we're having to restructure again what we would have thought was the East or the forbidden. And now we're trying to welcome them in. What is your thought on that?
Marvelous. Very, very, very good question. Exactly. I strongly argue that the West is being redefined since the invasion of Ukraine. The West has been redefined since the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course. So there were countries that always saw themselves as Western. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland in particular always saw themselves as Western. They were part of the Habsburg Empire. They were part of Western empires. They were, most of them, Catholic or Protestant. So suddenly, they find themselves in the East after the Second World War, and most famously, Milan Kundera, in a very widespread article, he called it the kidnapped West, the tragedy of Central Europe, or the kidnapped West. So they were kidnapped and taken to the East. They have always had a grudge about that. So then they after the end of the Cold War, countries that saw themselves as culturally Western in Central Europe see themselves as returning to the Western civilization they always belonged to. But much more than that is happening, as you are saying. Countries that historically were not part of the cultural West, so Orthodox countries like Romania, Bulgaria, obviously Greece since long earlier, although Orthodox had joined the West for various reasons. And most importantly and most crucially today, Ukraine. The Ukrainians are in the same situation as the Greeks in the 1820s in a way, exactly 200 years ago, exactly this year. So 1825, Benjamin Constant, the famous Swiss-born French member of parliament and political philosopher, wrote a pamphlet in support of the Greeks during the revolution against the Ottoman Empire. And part of his argument was the Greeks are a people who are still willing to fight and die for freedom. We are not anymore. We are a little bit softened by our luxuries and by our security, and we are not prepared to fight. These people are prepared to fight. So the cause of the Greeks is our cause. La cause des Grecs est la nôtre. Somehow he was also saying, as other French commentators were saying, this is a rampart of the West. He used the word la garantie véritable de l'Occident contre l'Orient. The real guarantee of the Occident, of the West against the East. So a similar thing. Aren't we talking about Ukraine like that? Everybody is saying correctly, they are willing to fight in a way we are not yet, and they are fighting for us. If Russia prevails there, other countries that are members of NATO and Western Europe might be much more worried. Look at Poland, look at Estonia in recent days. So a similar thing. So part of my argument, I don't want to complicate it too much, is the West has been, from the beginning, from the 18th century, not a genetically or religiously defined club, in the sense that from the very beginning, Auguste Comte made an exception and said, although the West is historically Charlemagne's empire, Western and Central Europe, we have to include two countries which are in Eastern Europe but have to be part of the West. Greece, because of the importance of ancient Greece to Rome and therefore to our civilization, although Greece was Orthodox, and Poland, because although it's a Slavic people, it's been Catholic for 1,000 years and therefore part of the Western cultural group that I'm talking about. So from the beginning, there is this inherent open-endedness to the West. So obviously in the Cold War, countries like Japan and Turkey started being considered Western in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. Mr. Erdogan may want to change that now. That's a long story. But what is happening now in recent years is, again, an expansion of the West to include countries like Ukraine, for example.
But we have the concept of, because when this is being written in the 19th century, the United States and Canada are only seen as they're only just becoming industrialized, so they haven't become big powers. Of course, now and during my generation, of course, the West meant from 1945 onwards, we had the backstop of the United States, and now we may look at European Westernism, if that's a word, as opposed to the West as it understood in America, because they are quickly becoming two different things.
Yes, absolutely. And again, nothing terribly surprising if you read my book. The United States was the last country of the current West to join the West, to identify as Western. They only started calling themselves part of the West and Western civilization in the end of the 19th century, with very few exceptions, the exceptions being German migrants and European migrants who were starting to try to persuade the Americans that they are part of Western civilization and the West, along with the West Europeans. The Americans, for various reasons, understandable reasons, didn't want to do anything to do with what they saw as the semi-feudal, aristocratic, imperialistic powers of Western Europe. They saw themselves as the first post-colonial nation. They had rebelled against the British Empire. A. B. They had another use for the term the West, their own shifting frontier. So the West meant something else in America. So they were the last to join into considering themselves part of the West and Western civilization, and it only prevailed in America with the First World War. When they joined, they had to start thinking seriously that they are part of the West and Western civilization, and then the Western civilization courses started in universities like Columbia and other Ivy League universities in the 1920s. And for some decades, Americans saw themselves as leaders of Western civilization. If now they isolate themselves for some time, there's nothing new about that. It's happened before, it may happen again. So yes, what you said is absolutely right. The West historically has been, the core of the West has been Western Europe. Western and Central Europe is the West. It started here, it's vital here for a very clear reason, because Russia is next door and the West Europeans see themselves as in some kind of danger by that enormous country, which from time to time has various designs to expand. And therefore, the United States militarily is obviously absolutely indispensable. But in terms of who takes initiative, who wants to save the West and its unity, it's the West Europeans that have to save Western unity, because we are going to suffer more. Obviously, the United States has enormous amounts of interest in keeping what is called the West together in the long term, even if its current president doesn't talk like that. But there is nothing strange about America becoming isolationist. It's happened many times. America First has been a slogan many times.
I mean, it was the slogan, 100 years ago, America First as a slogan. The great irony of this, of course, is St. Petersburg, and Peter the Great is written. I mean, he spends time in London, he spends time in Amsterdam. The Russian flag is based on the Dutch flag, etc. He's looking westward with St. Petersburg. He doesn't want to look towards. He's rejecting all the old Russian imperialist ways, and that perhaps, Georgios, is the greatest irony of this.
Yes, the greatest irony and the greatest tragedy, because if you remember, even Putin started up to 15 years ago, he was saying that Russia is part of Western civilization, it's coming back to Europe. Sorry, not Western, European. He wasn't saying Western.
Yeah.
So the stakes are very high. If Russia could join Europe in some form, cooperating and so on, the trouble has always been its size. Its size is so enormous that it can absorb Europe. So you can't imagine Russia joining the EU because there would be a disproportionate, they would be too big. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where what now looks as a strange thing has been historically what has always been in the history of the idea of the West, which is the West is primarily defined vis-a-vis Russia, fear of Russia, anxiety about Russia. I wouldn't call it Russophobia because the term means something else now, but in the original meaning, in the etymological meaning of phobos means fear in Greek. Fear of Russia, anxiety about Russia is the raison d'être of the West.
The book is called The West, The History of an Idea. If people want to find you online and continue the conversation, I could continue this conversation until Wednesday, Georgia, but unfortunately, time is going to beat me. So where is the best place to find you online?
My website, Queen Mary University of London, Department of History. I'm happy to answer emails, of course.
The book is, by the way, listeners, you can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Go onto our virtual bookstore and you will find a front cover. Click on it and it will be winging its way to you. The book is called The West, The History of an Idea. It is by Georgios Varouxakis, and I hope I got that correct this time. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
Same here. Thank you.